Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Well, today we are diving headfirst into a situation that is as complex as it is urgent.
Really hits close to home, too.
It does. We're talking about the escalating conflict in the Middle East. You've sent us a stack of articles, reports from Beirut, Jerusalem, even Yemen. It's like the whole region is a tinderbox.
And we're feeling the weight of those headlines, believe me.
Our mission today, to cut through the noise. Understand what's happening, but more importantly, why it matters to you.
You got it. And what we're seeing isn't just a few isolated incidents, right? It's like this dangerous chain reaction.
Fueled by,
Years of tension, strategic alliances, some very old grudges.
to grasp the gravity of the situation, we really need to start with the human cost.
And right now, Beirut is at the heart of that story.
You highlighted some firsthand accounts from Beirut, and let me tell you, they are chillin'. Explosions rocking the city.
Smoke filling the sky.
Families desperately trying to escape to safety.
These aren't just news stories. These are people caught in a terrifying reality.
And we have to remember, this isn't Beirut's first experience with conflict, right?
Not even close.
To understand the current situation, we need to consider Hezbollah's role in Lebanon.
They're a powerful force, politically, militarily, backed by Iran, which puts them directly at odds with Israel.
Who sees them as a threat?
Exactly. Add to that Lebanon's own internal struggles, economic crisis, the aftermath of that horrible port explosion in 2020, and you've got a population already reeling from one crisis after another.
It's like they were barely given a chance to breathe before this latest escalation hit.
And speaking of escalation, Israel's vow of retaliation, sending shockwaves through the region,
They're saying this response will be severe. Reports suggesting everything's on the table.
targeting Iranian oil fields.
Even striking nuclear facilities.
It's high stakes, no question. Israel is trying to walk a tightrope. They want to project strength, deter future attacks, but they also want to avoid sparking a full-blown regional war.
So every decision they make right now,
Carries enormous weight.
it's like the whole world is holding its breath waiting to see what they'll do.
And if this situation wasn't tense enough,
Right.
this is all happening just days before the one-year anniversary of the October 7th terror attacks.
The sources mentioned the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, are already engaging with multiple groups.
Hamas in Gaza,
Hezbollah in Lebanon.
even the Houthis in Yemen.
It's a powder keg.
Anniversaries like this, they have a way of stirring up old tensions, becoming flashpoints for renewed violence. And remember, this isn't just about military strategy.
It's about.
History, identity, the weight of past trauma. Add that to an already volatile situation and the risk of a misstep, of things spiraling out of control.
Incredibly high.
Incredible. You're absolutely right to point that out. Timing adds a whole other layer of complexity. And frankly, the situation in Beirut was already incredibly fragile even before these recent missile attacks.
Right. You mentioned Lebanon facing multiple crises. It's easy for things to get lost when we're talking about events moving this fast.
Exactly.
Can you remind us what the situation was like in Beirut before this latest escalation?
Well, Lebanon has been grappling with a perfect storm of crises, really. Imagine a country mired in a deep economic crisis. Inflation so out of control that basic goods have become unaffordable for so many.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you add the social and political scars left by that devastating 2020 Beirut port explosion.
Oh, man, that explosion was horrific. I remember those images. The sheer scale of the destruction was hard to comprehend.
It was a gut punch, no doubt about it. But beyond the immediate impact, it really exposed these deep-rooted issues within the Lebanese government: corruption, mismanagement, further eroding whatever public trust was left.
Yeah.
The country was already on a knife's edge, and this latest conflict has only pushed them closer to the brink.
And then you have Hezbollah, which, as you explained, is a major player in all of this. But how does a group like that, with ties to Iran, operate within the context of Lebanon's own internal struggles?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Hezbollah, they walk this fine line. They position themselves as the defenders of Lebanon, particularly against Israeli aggression.
Right.
And they do have a lot of support for that. But they also have this powerful grip on Lebanese politics, and they're often seen as a proxy for Iran's interests in the region.
So their involvement in this current conflict, while deeply concerning, isn't all that surprising when you consider that relationship with Iran.
Precisely. Hezbollah's actions can't be viewed in isolation. Their ties to Iran, it means they're a crucial piece in this regional power struggle, and any move they make has the potential to set off a chain reaction. And remember, Israel sees them as directly responsible for at least some of these recent attacks.
And that brings us to Israel's response, which they've promised will be severe. We've heard reports about potential targets, including Iran's oil fields. But you also mentioned that President Biden has discouraged Israel from taking that particular action.
Right.
What are the implications of that, especially with other options like striking nuclear facilities still being considered?
That's a crucial point. Biden's intervention highlights just how high the stakes are. A direct strike on Iran's oil infrastructure could have devastating ripple effects, not just in the region, but globally. We're talking about a potential energy crisis, skyrocketing oil prices, and who knows what the geopolitical fallout would be. So while that option seems to be off the table for now, the fact that it was even considered shows you how serious this situation is.
And to make matters even more complex, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, publicly defended the missile strikes during Friday prayers. He called them legal and legitimate, which certainly doesn't suggest they're backing down.
No, it doesn't. Khamenei's statement indicates that Iran views its actions as justified retaliation,
Right.
likely for Israeli operations against their interests in the region. This is a dangerous game of tit for tat, and it's hard to see how this ends well.
So we're essentially at an impasse. Israel feels they're committed to responding forcefully, but also wanting to avoid triggering a wider war. What factors do you think will influence their decision-making process? I mean, this isn't just a military calculation, is it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Israel is under immense pressure, both domestically and internationally.
Right.
Domestically, they've got to consider public opinion, the upcoming elections in the U.S., a key ally.
Sure.
Internationally, they need to weigh the potential for global condemnation if they're seen as overreacting. They have to consider the reactions of their allies, particularly the U.S.
Right.
And of course, the possibility of igniting a much larger conflict, one that could engulf the entire region.
It's like they're trying to play chess on a board where the pieces keep changing and every move could have unforeseen consequences.
That's a chillingly accurate analogy. And we haven't even factored in the potential for miscalculation, for things to spiral out of control even if no one intends for them to.
Right.
A stray missile, a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of intentions. These things happen, particularly in the heat of the moment. Any one of them could be disastrous.
And as we discussed, the approaching anniversary of the October 7th terror attacks only adds fuel to the fire.
Exactly. Anniversaries like this are often exploited by groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, to rally support, potentially incite violence.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous combination. Heightened tensions, a volatile environment, and a history that continues to cast a long shadow.
So if we try to look ahead, what are the key indicators that we should be watching for? What signs point towards either de-escalation or a further slide towards a wider conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
First and foremost, watch how Israel chooses to respond. Is it measured, carefully calibrated to target only those directly involved in the missile attacks? Or is it broader, more forceful, aimed at sending a message? Second, pay close attention to how Iran and its allies, especially Hezbollah, react. Do they retaliate further, escalating that cycle of violence? Or do they choose restraint, however unlikely that may seem? And finally, keep an eye on the diplomatic efforts taking place behind closed doors.
Right.
Are there any attempts to mediate the situation? To find a peaceful resolution before this thing spirals even further out of control? The answers to those questions will likely determine the fate of the region in the coming days and weeks.
It's a waiting game, but the stakes are incredibly high. Now, before we move on to discuss the potential global implications of this conflict, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the human cost. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess game of it all.
Right.
But at the heart of this are real people whose lives are being upended. It really is easy to forget about that, isn't it? In the midst of all this chaos.
It's tragic, really. We're talking about families forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in a country already grappling with its own set of challenges.
Right.
Imagine being a parent in Beirut right now, trying to explain to your children why their world has been turned upside down.
I can't even imagine.
Why they can't sleep in their own beds, why they can't go to school. The psychological toll, especially on children, it's immeasurable.
And you said over 1 million people have already been displaced in Lebanon because of the fighting.
Over 1.2 million, at least, according to UN estimates.
Wow.
And that number is only expected to rise. So then you have to consider the logistics of providing basic necessities for these displaced individuals. Food, water, shelter, medical care.
It's a humanitarian crisis on top of everything else.
Exactly. The international community has a responsibility to mobilize resources and provide aid to those affected by this crisis, regardless of the political complexities.
It's a stark reminder that behind the headlines, behind all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real people grappling with unimaginable loss and uncertainty.
And fear.
Their stories deserve our attention just as much as the political and military dimensions of this conflict. Okay, so we've talked about the human cost, but you mentioned earlier that the ripple effects of this crisis, they extend far beyond the immediate region,
Oh, absolutely.
impacting everything from global energy markets to international relations.
This has the potential to be a global crisis.
Let's talk about the potential global implications. We touched upon this earlier, the possibility of skyrocketing oil prices if Iran's oil industry is targeted.
Right.
Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Sure.
How would a conflict in the Middle East, how would that translate to higher gas prices for everyday people thousands of miles away?
It all boils down to the interconnected nature of the global energy market.
Right.
Now, Iran might seem geographically distant from, let's say, the United States or Europe, but they are a major player in the global oil supply chain.
Yeah.
Any disruption to their oil production, whether it's through direct strikes or just political instability that impacts their ability to export, that creates this ripple effect throughout the entire system.
So it's a supply and demand issue.
Exactly. Oil prices are determined by supply and demand. So when the supply drops, prices go up.
And that impacts consumers at the pump.
Right. It's a stark example of how interconnected our world really is. And then you've got the potential impact on the upcoming U.S. presidential election.
Right. What role could this distant conflict play in how Americans vote?
Well, foreign policy often takes center stage during U.S. elections, and this situation is no exception. The current administration is going to be under immense pressure to navigate this crisis very carefully. They have to balance national security interests with the need to avoid a wider war.
Right.
How they handle the situation, it's undoubtedly going to be scrutinized and debated by both sides of the political spectrum. And, that has the potential to influence voter decisions come November.
So it's something that seems like it's a world away could end up being a deciding factor in who occupies the Oval Office. It's a sobering thought.
It certainly is. And it just underscores the complexities of global politics, the way that seemingly isolated events can have these far-reaching and often unpredictable consequences.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's clear this situation is far from over. As we wrap up this deep dive, what key takeaways should our listener keep in mind as they continue to follow this story?
I think first and foremost, remember that this conflict, it's the culmination of decades of these deep-seated historical grievances, complex geopolitical factors at play here.
So you really need to go beyond the headlines.
Yes. To truly understand what's happening, you need to look beyond those headlines. Delve into the history of the region, the motivations of the key players, the long shadow of past conflicts.
It's about connecting the dots.
Exactly.
Understanding the context in which these events are unfolding.
Precisely. And secondly, pay close attention to the actions and reactions of all parties involved, not just Israel and Iran.
Right. What role are other global powers like Russia, China, the European Union, what role are they playing?
Are they trying to mediate the situation? Or are they trying to exploit it for their own strategic gain? It's a multidimensional chess game we're talking about here. Every move has the potential to tip that balance.
We've talked about potential military responses, but what about diplomatic solutions? I mean, are there back channels of communication open? Are there efforts being made to de-escalate the situation through dialogue? Those details, they're often less visible,
Right.
but they could be the key to preventing further bloodshed.
Exactly. Don't just focus on the military hardware, the troop movements. Look for signs of diplomatic engagement, however subtle they may be. They might be the faint glimmer of hope in an otherwise very dark and uncertain time.
It's a lot to process. There's no easy answers. But as we always say, the best antidote to uncertainty is knowledge.
You're here.
Keep asking those questions. Stay informed from reliable sources. And engage in thoughtful analysis. The situation is far from over. The coming days and weeks are going to be critical. Until next time, keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us.